Welcome back to our series on James, the book of James, and how Jesus' half-brother spoke so fiercely against injustice and classism and any number of other isms where people claim superiority over one group or one group over another. Today we're going to get into chapter 3 and talk about the damage of denigrating language. And especially in these days of rancor, in our national conversation, Christians could stand to take James' advice and take the rhetoric and the combative pitch down a notch, don't you think? The name-calling and hateful talk just doesn't befit the Christian, especially as it often reveals a sense of superiority of one person or group over another. Let me back up and say this. I don't think the best way to read the book of James is as though it were a collection of unrelated sermons. I mean, he has a clear theme in mind, and virtually everything he says in these 5 chapters supports that theme, which is, in my opinion, Christianity and classism, how they clash. I mean, he does go back and forth between subtopics like a house painter painting one coat and waiting for it to dry, and then later comes back to put on another coat or two, but eventually the whole house gets painted, right? And that's how James seems to roll. Most commentators and preachers would say that James is all about good works, but I think they often miss it. There's a particular category of good works that James has in mind, that the rich and the poor and the educated and the uneducated, the powerful and the powerless, are all made from the same stuff. And that we've got to have mutual respect for one another. And those with power and privilege and resources are obligated before God to serve those that don't have those things. I mean, it's just so clear. I mean, you could say that James was the first Christian advocate of social justice. There, I said it, social justice. Some of you will maybe freak out about that term. It's just a biblical concept if you see it through the lens of Scripture. So now we arrive at chapter 3 for his second coat of paint on the subject of how real Christians speak to and about other people. I mean, he contends that any talk that suggests others as non-persons is evil and devilish and is counterproductive and counter-kingdom. Denigrating speech affirms classism instead of crushing it. So James says in chapter 3, verse 6, the tongue, speech, the tongue is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. And it corrupts the whole body. It sets the whole course of one's life on fire and is itself set on fire by hell. It's a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Well, that's pretty strong language, but I think his point is bigotry eventually comes out of the mouth. I mean, it begins maybe in an unconscious attitude, but if unchecked, it passes through the lips and onto your hands and feet. Insulting language, in other words, it's a conversation stopper and a compassion killer. It diminishes another person's worth. It's really a form of violence. I mean, Proverbs says that life or the power of life and death is in the tongue. So denigrating speech, it's a lose-lose proposition. It harms both the speaker and the hearer. It plants a seed of shame and inferiority in the receiver, but also damages the soul of the speaker. You know, there are a lot of shock jock radio talk show hosts, but I'm thinking of one in particular that claims to be a Christian who is one of the most abusive in the business to my mind. Anyone who disagrees with him, he calls them idiots, he calls them stupid, he calls them evil scum, and I quote, evil scum. In fact, one of his favorite labels for people that don't think like he does is he calls them vermin. And I just can't understand how a Christian wouldn't be convicted by the Spirit for that kind of behavior, especially in the public arena. Sadly, I would have to say that we have a president right now who has made denigrating speech into an art form. And I'm not going to belabor this, but here are just a few of his most disrespectful insults of other colleagues, many of them in government. Pocahontas, the Indian, sleepy, creepy Joe, wacky and deranged Omarosa, or he calls her also crazed, crying lowlife Omarosa. Horse-faced Stormy Daniels, the Dick, Hillary Clinton, the Skank, brain-dead Bernie, no talent Samantha Bee, Jeff Bozo, and on and on and on. And it wouldn't be quite as terrible if those who call themselves Christians didn't applaud these insults and take them as permission to do the same thing. I'm not trying to pile on these two as though they're the only culprits, but this behavior is infectious, especially when it comes from people in power and privilege. So James says this is paramount, I should say, to cursing human beings who have been made in God's likeness. That's a quote. That's what's so problematic about denigrating speech. It assaults God's imprint on the human soul. It's right up there with blasphemy. And I wonder how it makes God feel when his kids curse one another and it sounds to me like he takes it personally. I mean, the thing about labels to me is that they're just too small to explain a human being to another, to explain a person. I mean, each image-bearing human is bigger than any one label can contain. And so it keeps the labeled person small and makes the labeler feel large. And so the implication is that this is the sum of this person. That's all they are. They've been labeled, they've been filed, they're one-dimensional. There's no way they can be any more than a hippie or a right-winger or a Baptist or a gay. So to me, when you label people, here's the crux of it. Denigrating speech and labeling is a way to assert your superiority over other people. You call someone stupid and you're claiming you're better than them because you're smart or you think you are. You're speaking down to them. You're being condescending to them. You know what Isaiah says? He says this, do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and instead spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed. Put away the pointing finger and malicious talk. Spend yourself, give your life over to meeting the needs of the oppressed. I mean, Jesus said, don't say reka to someone or call them a fool. That means you're nothing to me. You're worthless. You're beneath my consideration. You're just a pissant. Excuse me for the language, but a guy 30 pounds heavier and 100 pounds stronger than me called me that when I tackled him in freshman football practice. Oh, okay. So I just happened to be in his way when he tripped over me, but let's not get bogged down in particulars. The thing is, I still remember it like it was yesterday for how he made me feel. Speaking down to people as though they actually are below us, it just doesn't fly with God or create a better world. What does please him and improves the world is something Paul said, and I quote, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, building them up, and it ministers grace to the hearers, end quote. Insults and labels, they disable people. Grace enables them. Grace empowers people to be their best selves. And we have the opportunity to be a part of that. Why wouldn't we want that? See you next time.